Hi everyone, so welcome to section 2 of this first module, and as you've seen from the title, we're looking here at the kind of the key policy drivers that have really pushed forward the idea of social inclusion and brought it into the policy space. And particularly we're going to talk to the international context, but particularly within Australia. So there's a reading for this section, which hopefully you've all been able to have a glance through. I thought that it might be useful to maybe go through this reading within this video and just talk you through some of the key points rather than kind of giving you a sort of PowerPoint lecture or a series of tasks. I thought it might be helpful to actually go through the reading together and we can see what kind of key points we've pulled out. And hopefully by doing this I'll be able to talk to some of those policy drivers and where this idea of social inclusion has come from. So from the last section you should have got at least some idea now of what social inclusion is and those different sort of ways of understanding social inclusion, and seeing that it's an incredibly complex policy area, and how that translates within education is going to be, of course, very sort of complex and messy. So hopefully all of these sections are building up to giving you that good detailed background knowledge of where social inclusion sits in an education setting that will give you the foundation to do a good assignment 1. So I'm just going to talk through the article. I'm not going to go through sort of all of it, but I've just highlighted what I consider to be key bits that sort of speak to this, where has social inclusion come from and some of the key aspects of social inclusion. So we'll just move through that now. Hopefully the video is going to be about 10 minutes just to sort of work through, and we'll give you that understanding of this article to move forward with. Okay, so just trying to move down now. Okay, so I guess the key thing here, if we're looking at sort of policy drivers and particularly the international scene, social inclusion was very much embedded within international policy within Europe, and particularly the UK, for a good sort of decade before it really started to emerge strongly in Australia. So there's obviously been close links between the UK and Australia, and as this article actually talks about, Australian policy tends to be a sort of hybrid between North American and European policies, and generally tend to emerge slightly later than they have within those countries. So if we're looking at a sort of a backdrop and a context to really understand how social inclusion has emerged within Australia, we need to sort of understand the UK context. And this article, as I said, I'm not going to go through this in depth, but this article does offer you that background to the UK context and how things have developed within Australia. So moving on now to the next highlighted point, I think this is quite key in terms of how social inclusion is understood within Australia. There's always been, I guess, within Australian culture this idea of the fair go, and that everyone should have the opportunity to make a go of things and to do well within Australian society, and that's very much sort of an embedded part of the values of Australia over sort of the last 40-50 years. I guess the key issue here, and where we critique it and where sort of government policies begun to critique this, is this sort of overarching concept of a fair go hasn't really translated into practice as such, and it's talking back to those ideas of what social inclusion actually is. Very much within Australia it's been a fair go for certain types of people, and we've seen obviously certain groups have been incredibly marginalised over the sort of history of Australia as a nation. The obvious case being Indigenous communities and how they fit within the concept of a fair go, and then more recently we've seen it with asylum seekers and refugee communities, and the sort of the antagonism felt by many Australian people towards these sort of invaders to our shore. So just to highlight there that yes, we sort of as a nation embrace this idea of everyone having equal opportunity, but in reality that hasn't actually played out. Okay, so again, sort of just moving on, and so really recommend you read through this and then sort of listen to my dialogue on it, so you've got that kind of background. But again, just to pick up on some of the stuff that's talked about in the previous section, just this idea of social exclusion being a multidimensional concept, and how this has led to changes in policy of how we understand what social inclusion is about. And particularly as this highlighted section says here on page 7, the sort of shifts in how social inclusion has been conceptualised within Europe has led to an understanding of social inclusion as not just being about money. So recognising that poverty is a major issue and a major factor causing people to be excluded, but it's not just about giving people money and that will then address social exclusion. And as it says here, it's instead beginning to move towards understanding social inclusion as a wholesale reconsideration of the ways in which our labour market and social services either enhance or constrain the life chances of Australians. So very much seeing social inclusion as a tool for changing the structures of the society rather than just changing the people. And as you can see, just with our links to education, which we'll talk about in the next section and how it all connects together, high quality education is seen within Australia and internationally as being the foundation of a socially inclusive society and nation. So again, down the bottom here, just talking back to that kind of idea that the sort of neoliberal agenda and how social inclusion can be understood within different kind of political persuasions. Sorry, so I'm just reading this through. So yeah, here just talking about the sort of the neoliberal agenda within Australia and how kind of social inclusion has emerged basically from that, and the kind of the failure of that agenda within Australian society. So it talks here as a new policy phase aimed at rebalancing economic and social policy after the excessive individualism of this neoliberal period. So just seeing again within Australia, and I think this is relevant to other countries, just this idea that everyone for themselves and the political persuasion towards that hasn't really worked. The interesting thing I'd say about this article, and hopefully something for you to take away and think about as you move forward in this, is where are we actually now within Australia. So this was written in 2010, where that sort of shift had happened, obviously with the change of government and particularly Abbott's current policies, Tony Abbott's current policies. We seem to be moving much more again towards that neoliberal agenda. So where does social inclusion now sit within an Australian policy framework? That's sort of something that's emerging very much over time and people are unsure about at the moment. So again, I've just made some comments on the PDF, which I've also put on Moodle here, but just to emphasise how social inclusion can fit amongst various political positions. Although we'd say it's more of a sort of left-sided policy agenda, it can be made to fit neoliberal perspectives, and just recognising that and understanding that there's different ways of seeing. So we can't just talk about social inclusion as being a good thing, it's how it's actually constructed and understood as to whether it's likely to have a sort of positive impact on society. I think a key issue here at the bottom of page 8 is this notion that social policy and economic policy are always sort of interrelated together. So again, if we look at policy drivers for social inclusion, the economy is always going to be a key policy driver on how significant or how embedded social inclusion actually is within any sort of country's policies. And obviously we've gone through the global financial crisis, which has created more need, I guess, for an awareness of social inclusion and social inclusion policies to address the poverty that's being experienced as a result of the global financial crisis. So, you know, that link between social and economic policy is very pertinent in terms of how social inclusion has emerged within Australia. Again, on page 9, I've just highlighted here about this sort of shift from a neoliberal perspective within Australia into a more socially inclusive one, and the idea of the social investment state has been sort of accepted. But again, I think we need to consider, is that the case now with the shift in government? How has that changed? So again, here I haven't highlighted particular things, but I think all of this is sort of relevant for you to look through. Again, just on page 11, just to highlight that education and skills are very much seen as part of the domains or dimensions of how people become socially excluded and what resources they don't have access to. So just to keep that in mind for when we move on to the connections with education here. And then just some sort of data really on looking at measuring social exclusion, and we're looking at percentages of people believed to be deeply excluded, so experiencing more than one facet of exclusion. We're looking at, you know, reasonably significant numbers here. Even though they seem quite small, that's still a significant minority experience deep exclusion within an Australian context. Okay, so I think this section is particularly relevant, why the sort of lukewarm reception. As soon as you can see, again, just this is basically just understanding this wider policy context and where it's emerged from and why. And this talks to, as I said earlier, the idea of Australian social policy being a hybrid between North American and European approaches. And here Smythe talks about, you know, the initial resistance because of the neoliberal government that was in place as these types of policies are sweeping through Europe. The government wasn't really receptive to these in Australia at that particular time, with Howard in charge. And also that Australia has traditionally really connected the idea of poverty with money, which can lead to the assumption that social exclusion is not a particular issue. So again, this section sort of moves on to talk to this a little bit more, and if you look at page 13 and what's been highlighted there. So that just emphasises this idea that traditionally Australian policy is sort of thought to address aspects of exclusion. You just basically need to give out money to people and that will sort them out. The idea of welfare funding and money, and that will address all issues. But as we've sort of talked about in the previous section, that doesn't really address the structural inequities that are causing the problem. So I think I've put it here. Yep, so this section here, I've sort of said it talks very much to that case study that was presented in the previous section of young people not in education, employment or training, which very much focuses on that sort of individual behaviour change rather than looking at how to address broader structures in society and social inequity. So that, you know, very much sits within a sort of neoliberal government, just the idea that we can solve the individual without looking at why the individual doesn't have any money. So this again is just the wider context of where the policies come from, and the recognition that this wasn't correct, it wasn't sort of working, just trying to give money to the poor wasn't actually changing their situation, and that a new approach was needed. So that's, you know, really a key policy driver there in why this change emerged. Okay, so this section is really useful for just highlighting the kind of policy changes that allowed social inclusion to enter into the social policy sphere within Australia. So I think I've highlighted the key things here, and as you can see as you go through within Australia, it's very much been a sort of state driven rather than a national driven agenda. So at that sort of local level, state government recognising that they were having communities that were just not travelling very well at all and needed more than just the basic sort of welfare to support and change. And so within this, very much as it says at the bottom of 14, the state started to opt for policies that looked at kind of community regeneration, community strengthening, and this spoke very much to the sort of the policy drivers within the UK, the idea of enhancing communities and supporting communities to then go on and help themselves in a real kind of community development approach, which we'll talk a lot more about communities in week 3. And then, as I said, this idea that just measuring poverty on money rather than the resources people need really started to emerge quite strongly as we need a change here at that national level. We need a change in policy direction to support the underprivileged people within our society. So as it talks to here, that sort of recognition led to this idea that we needed a multidimensional approach to understanding disadvantage and deprivation, and social inclusion provided that policy tool to do so. So I guess here, I think this is sort of key on page 17, this idea as well that within Australia it wasn't just enough to sort of have that neoliberal understanding of social inclusion that was talked about in the first section, but there needed to be some sort of combination of economic and social policy together, and a tool to allow that to happen. So as it says there, the bridging of two worlds of welfare and economic policy, and social inclusion was really seen as a means that could possibly allow that to happen. So there was still investment in economic policy and still sort of driving within that, but a recognition that more needed to be done to change the structures at community level to allow everyone to engage within that economic sphere. Now, obviously, the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard has been instrumental within Australia with driving forward the concept of social inclusion. She was Minister for Social Inclusion before she was Prime Minister, and has really sort of pushed this agenda within her government. And again, the rhetoric that she talks about is this move away from giving individuals money to actually investing in them and their communities to bring them into the mainstream. So if we're talking about investment in individuals, raising their capabilities, hopefully you can start to see already that, you know, education has got to play quite a key role in this and has to be quite a foundational concept if these policies are actually going to translate into practice. So again, I haven't highlighted specific bits here, but I think this provides useful sort of background, and again this idea of the international drivers and how the international field has shaped what's happening in Australia. So work through this. And again, just very much how it actually plays out in Australia through understanding the UK background. So this section here is really talking to how it starts to sort of roll out in practice, and the idea that it's got to be different. It's not just a case of sort of welfare state, neoliberal agenda, that doesn't work, go back to the welfare state, but this idea that social inclusion needs to provide something different. It's got to have the kind of means of embracing everyone and looking after everyone, while still recognising that we need a competitive economy within Australia for success. So just again to emphasise the key policy driver was we need to have a new way of thinking about how we're going to look after our underprivileged groups within society, but still maintain our competitive advantage as a nation. And this section here just again talks to this sort of the idea of neoliberalism's failure, and the fact that reducing welfare and restricting welfare didn't necessarily lead to a competitive global economy, and instead actual countries that have been shown to put high investment in welfare have managed to have very strong global economies as well. So a lot of the European countries, Germany would be a great example of that, Scandinavian countries that invest a high amount in welfare but continue to have this good economic growth rates as well. So this idea of neoliberalism not really working, which again, coming back to where we're going now, you've really got to question the direction of the current government, who seem to be returning to this approach that we know doesn't really work for an inclusive and productive Australian society. So these sort of latter sections of this paper do talk about the idea of, to achieve social inclusion, you need well-educated individuals, and individuals capable of entering the labour market. But this sort of talks about some of the limitations of social inclusion, and that there's no guarantee that jobs that people can move into are going to offer that. And again, I think that really talks back to that case study of the sorts of jobs that young people actually entered into after going through a kind of social inclusion based project. They're on low paid, short-term contracts, uncertain jobs. So it's about how education can actually connect with the type of employment that should be offered there. So again, just in the conclusion, I sort of think this is the crux of the policy drivers. This shift away from a neoliberal agenda, a shift away from the idea that money alone is going to solve society's problems, and a much more holistic view of how to actually enhance and develop communities as a whole, and have these two ideas of sort of welfare and support alongside economically competitive policy approach. And that's really where sort of social inclusion as a concept has emerged from within Australia. I guess the key thing here is this article sort of talks to, whilst this is the kind of the policy vision for it, how much it's actually occurred in reality is still very much unknown. And as I keep saying, really sort of we need to look at contemporary situation and see what's going to happen now. The social inclusion unit that's been discussed in this article has subsequently been disbanded by Abbott. It's obviously a shift in policies, a sort of reduction of investment in education, a lack of focus on education. So the situation for social inclusion is very much sort of fluid and dynamic at the moment, and very much changing here, which we'll look at moving forward. Okay, so hopefully that's just given you a couple of insights and some of the things you might want to unpick about this article. But I think should, like, reading the whole should give you a good sort of overview and understanding of where social inclusion has come from and what the significance is and what it's trying to do. So in the next section we'll really begin to look at unpicking that within an educational context.